I would like to welcome Peter Mousaferiadis, CEO and founder, Cultural Infusion from Australia, who will speak on the role of culture in building a secure and peaceful world. Peter, if you can hear us, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I apologize for being a little bit late. For some reason, I confused the times. It's 8:45 here PM in Melbourne, Australia. And Melbourne has probably become famous for having the longest lockdown, 267 days. I'm just recovering from COVID. I was in bed for 2 weeks, was fully vaccinated, and it completely floored me. So protect yourselves. Where I come from in Australia, it's customary to do a traditional welcome. And where I live in Melbourne, there are 5 tribes: the Bunurong, the Djadjawurrung, the Taungurung, Wadawurrung, and the Woiwurrung people who make up what we call the Kulin Nation of the city of Melbourne. And the city of Melbourne has always been an important meeting place and location for events of education, social, sporting, spiritual, and cultural significance. Today, we're all coming together just like the past and the present. And I also want to acknowledge the future custodians and their respective connection to land, water, and communities. And I also want to acknowledge any elders that might be amongst us today. It's a little well-known fact that before Europeans colonized Australia in the late 1700s, there were an estimated 700 languages and speech communities and dialects, and more than 324 distinct ethnic groups, or as we would probably describe as nation states today. Today, there are very few left. There are 50 languages that are spoken, and only 15 of those 700 languages and dialects which are being taught to young people. Before I started to have my career running a whole group of cultural enterprises, I also had a career as a conductor, a composer, a creative director. I produced countless productions, including 9 major Australia Day concerts, which had a huge intercultural and multicultural flavour. At my last Australia Day concert, which I produced in 2012, I was backstage with the most senior First Nations custodian of the city of Melbourne, the custodian of the Wurundjeri people. And I spoke to the custodian. Her name was Joy Murphy. And I said, Joy, how many thousands of people speak Woiwurrung, the language of your people? How many thousands? Sadly, she replied, there's only one living person who speaks the language of my people, my auntie. I post a thought to all of us. How would you feel if you were the last surviving speaker of your mother tongue? I'm going to return to Australia and its cultural diversity, and I'm going to reflect on our greatest asset in a moment, humanity's greatest brand, our most underutilized brand, our cultural diversity. The pandemic has wreaked havoc across the world, and it's having disproportionate impact on individuals and communities across the globe. It has perpetuated difference, poverty, inequality, discrimination, and exclusion. And we've just seen in the last few days how the world is shutting its borders on a whole range of states from Africa. Yet it's not shutting its borders on Australia or Belgium or Portugal or the UK. We are not in this altogether. The pandemic has also highlighted humanity's failure to come together and develop a global coordinated response. I'd like to offer a moment's silence to those who are less fortunate than us today. Let's spare a thought. Culture is a mighty force. It's a double-edged sword. According to UNESCO, culture is a driver of sustainable development, an eradicator of poverty. It's key to quality education and key to building peaceful, cohesive, and tolerant communities. I'd also like to add that culture is also a driver of innovation. Knowledge is based on the diversification of ideas. So what better way to innovate than by bringing diverse perspectives together? So what is culture? Culture is a problematic term. I would say, what isn't culture? Culture is overarching, it's underpinning. Simply put, culture is the ways in which a particular group of people live. It includes shared knowledge, values, customs, and even includes symbols and physical objects. It's so much more than the arts. So when we hear the word culture, what are we referring to? Are we referring to a national culture? Are we referring to an ethno-linguistic religious culture of a group or an individual? Are we referring to organizational or workplace culture, that is the systems and behaviors and values that an organization's employees are required to subscribe to? Our organization, 7 years ago, after working in the space of promoting diversity, and in particular cultural diversity, since 1998, we decided to conduct a whole lot of literature reviews and put a team of subject matter experts together to try to define what appeared to be something that was poorly defined: cultural diversity, analytically neglected and in need of robust understanding. And what we did was we were able to disaggregate cultural diversity into 4 pillars: country of birth, going back 3 generations. We were also able to disaggregate it into religion or spiritual traditions or worldview as a way of how we make sense of all living things around us. We were able to also disaggregate it into cultures, subgroups, ethnicity, ancestral heritage, and also languages and speech communities. We built this massive database, and something that I've been developing for the better part of, well, over 2 decades, 3 decades now, since 1988. A huge database that ensures an inclusive data set that ensures no one is left out. More than 45,000 categories. And the way that we categorize that data allows us to look at the relationship of one culture to the next. When we started to look at diversity, we started to also look at the metrics of diversity. Diversity just means difference. So what does that difference look like? We came up with 3 metrics: variety, balance, and disparity. So let me just explain each of those. Let's say variety, in the case of variety, which means the absence of homogeneity. In one group, we might have 2 Italian and 2 French people. And in another group, we have a French, Italian, Portuguese, and Spanish. We have greater variety there. So we can apply a metric to that. Balance is the second metric, which looks at the distribution of what we're trying to measure across an organization. And we found in Australia, with the Human Rights Commission, recently conducted a report which stated that the further north you go, the more monocultural Australia became. So much to the point that 97% of all the key leadership positions that were being held in Australia were by people from Northern European background, not at all reflective of the multicultural nature of Australia. The last metric is a really important metric. It's this disparity or this dissimilarity of what we're trying to look at. Now, remember that group that I talked about, the French, Italian, Portuguese, and Spanish? Now I want you to think of another group, which might have Arabic, Portuguese, Japanese, and Swahili speaking people. The diversity there is greater. We know that one's ethno-linguistic background influences cognitive processes. It shapes empathy. It shapes a smile. The world is not all individualistic. 15% of the world is individualistic. 85% of the world is collectivist. We all see the world through our own lens. There are 193 full member states, 2 non-member states, and they have all their dependent territories. But what about the 11,500 languages and speech communities? What about all the ethnicities across the globe? Where is their voice? How do we now begin across the globe to create encounters that are able to synthesize those incommensurate cultural and social differences? How do we do that? The solution is there, in my opinion. The solution for me is in culture. And as I said, culture is overarching. It's underpinning. Every society has a culture, a way of thinking, a way of behaving. It has its social norms. All these guide society. So if you want to have social change, then you need to change the culture before you can change the society. So in other words, what I'm saying is social change is embedded in cultural change. Do we need to revision our societies? A not so well-known statistic. According to UNESCO, 75% of all the conflict we have in the world has a cultural dimension. And according to the Global Peace Index, established by an Australian philanthropist, Stephen Killalea, the cost of conflict in the world equates to almost 14% of the world's GDP. It doesn't take much to work out that the world is therefore spending more than $10 trillion every year dealing with the cost of conflict, which has a cultural dimension. Think about that. Not 10 billion, $10 trillion spent on dealing with conflict, which is a cultural dimension. So the question to all of us is, why are we not re-envisioning societies to put culture at the heart of all education, development, and progress? The lifeblood of culture is confluence, convergence. Cultures need to be reinventing themselves. They are not there to be essentialized, to put a border around them. We need to revision not just our societies, but we need to also think of the modern day nation state, which is now being challenged by the cultures that exist within them and the cultures that spread across those boundaries. In order to stay vibrant, cultures need to absorb, adapt constantly to their environment. History tells us again and again that societies have forever coexisted and have done so successfully. This is exemplified in architecture, language, gastronomy, science, maths, visual arts, languages, and so many other disciplines. Think of the numerical system we have today, which has been around for 1,000 years. This was not one culture bequeathing this to us. This was the Arabs converging with Persians, with Hellenic thought, with Hindu thought, to give us this incredible system. Think of the bionic eye and how that's come about as the convergence of many different disciplines coming together to give us something that would have seemed impossible many, many years ago. We have the early stages of a bionic eye. Think of First Nations people, Indigenous people, and their contribution to medicines. Their contribution to how to live with nature. In Jeddah, they're building the very first desalination plant in the world, which is carbon neutral free. This is not one culture developing it. This is Saudi Arabia opening itself to the world and saying to cultures, let's put our minds together to give something new to humanity. But none of this innovation would have been possible without one thing: intercultural dialogue. Intercultural dialogue, along with acceptance and tolerance, become the premise for innovation. So the point I'm making here is that cultures are not exclusive. Why do we exclude them? Cultures need to be constantly reinventing themselves, and when they come together, they can create something incredible. But we're not seeing that. Since the 1960s, we've seen the rise of identity politics. The World Wide Web in 1989 was developed by Tim Berners-Lee, the year that the Berlin Wall collapsed, supposedly the wall that would end all wars. And in 2007, what did we see? The rise of social media. In a way, the latter has fueled identity politics, leading to polarization of public discourse and to the ridiculing and dehumanizing of entire cultural groups. We are living in a super diverse world where the World Wide Web and social media has allowed for extremist thinking to be shared instantly across the globe with like-minded people. But since 2007, we've also witnessed something else. We've witnessed the decline of peace according to the Global Peace Index. We saw how social media fueled the Arab Spring in 2011. And 10 years later, my children see TikTok as being the latest scientific journal. And not only them, but so many others. We are seeing social media platforms feeding into that biological mechanism, which has taken more than 200,000 years to evolve. Fear. What drives fear is ignorance. What are the counter drivers? Familiarization and collaboration. So the point I'm making is that we have many challenges that we're experiencing across the world. But I want to talk a little bit about peace because I've spoken a lot about culture. According to the Global Peace Index, there are 8 pillars and 23 indicators that make up peace. Steve Kilalaya took a measurement approach to peace. But you know, this idea of taking a measurement approach to peace isn't a new idea. In the 5th century BC, according to my ancestors, the ancient Greeks, they also took a measurement approach to peace. The Greek word for peace is erini, and erini is derived from the verb ero, which means to string all the different components together, which make up peace into a state of equilibrium. If there's one missing link or one weak link, peace collapses. This is a very similar notion to what someone came up with 2,500 years later. Yes, we don't need to look too far. The answers are in history. And of course, the Greeks went to measuring everything. That notion of peace, of course, changed when Alexander the Expansionist made his way to South Asia and was introduced to different notions of peace. So we need to think of peace more than just maybe as we see it as a state of inner peace. Let's think of it in terms of measurement. So peace today does not mean the total absence of any conflict. It means the absence of violence in all forms and the unfolding of conflict in a constructive way. Peace, therefore, exists where people are interacting non-violently and are managing their conflict positively with respect, with respectful attention to the legitimate needs and interests of all concerns. Yes, peace is defined, and I'm talking about positive peace, is defined as the attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. But for me, how do we now start to understand peace and culture, and how do we utilize these concepts to create a secure world? In my opinion, it's all about data and inclusive data sets. And we heard our previous speaker talk about this. The true opportunity and the participation gap is not properly understood because consistent, reliable data on inclusion and representation doesn't exist. If you want to create a more equitable society, more representative society, more equitable society, how do you do that if you don't take a data-driven approach? How do you do that if you don't understand the diversity? We know that representation leads to more peaceful societies. Our organization, after 6 years of research, developed a platform called Diversity Atlas, which allows organizations to discover their hidden diversity and develop inclusion and equitable strategies. But I also want to talk about environmental climate change. That's another global concern. And it's something that's making many people insecure across the globe. 50 million people were displaced last year because of climate change. By the year 2100, there will be more than 1.4 billion people that will be displaced by global change. We are living, in my opinion, in a decisive decade. There's the convergence of many global challenges, which are going to require a global coordinated effort. It's high time for us to understand how we can use culture better to create settings, and like I said earlier on, to synthesize those new ways of communicating across cultural and geopolitical divides. What will this communication look like? And how are we going to utilize data in creating these settings that synthesize what appears to be these incommensurate cultural and social differences? The answer lies, in my opinion, in culture and recognizing that my security is your security and your security is everybody's security. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was very, very interesting. Thank you so much for being here with us today and offering us this speech. I would like to ask our colleagues if there are any questions or remarks addressed to Peter. If you have any, please just raise your hand. Okay, if there are no questions and no remarks.
Yeah, I have just one.
Okay, Professor Fidelis, please.
I have just one question. Yeah, thank you so much, Peter, for your presentation. I would like to believe that in your definition of culture, it is quite exhaustive. I want to ask about the global capitalist order. Does the global capitalist order, especially because you mentioned climate change, does the global capitalist order has capacity for a distinctive culture that works against the climate, works against equality? Does the global capitalist order have a self-generating culture that is inimical to the climate and equality globally?
Thank you very much for your question, Fidelis Allen. I might answer that by looking at the United Nations when it was established in 1948. It spent the next 25 to 30 years developing a whole range of different strategies. But those strategies were developed by people from the global north and with the view from Northern European and mainly American-centric background, with the view of advancing neoliberalism and people that came from highly individualistic backgrounds with no regard for the global south. We're now seeing the outcome of that. I don't think there's any other choice. That I think we can be looking towards different perspectives, and the majority of the world is collectivist. I see that from the culture that I come from, which was, Greek, and also my grandparents who came from, the Ottoman Empire. A very different way to how Northern Europeans see the world. And I think that we need to start to reflect on the decisions we've made and start to think of a new economic paradigm. And that's maybe time for another discussion, but maybe an economic paradigm that also begins to put the onus on every single person, that removes the trapped energy that you find within the pure constructs of the public realm and the private realm, and begins to commence a process where everyone starts to demonstrate how they can give back to the community. Because at the moment, the paradigm that's been set up for the profit entity is about just making profits at the end of the day, with no regard for the other. And I think we can learn a lot from the global south and from other cultures. They think there's a profound difference in thinking. And we don't talk about this. We don't talk about all the conflict that we have in the world. And I talked about, the cultural dimension. Just think now, the US and its coalition and all its supporters went into Afghanistan for 20 years and has nothing to show for it. We're not talking about the cultural dimension. It went in there without recognizing how many different ethno-linguistic groups lived in Afghanistan. It made no effort over those 20 years to bridge those differences, to understand those differences. So I think the answer lies in culture, and I think the answer lies in how we're going to start this new form of encounter that's not approached from a value-centric, social-centric, or ethnocentric perspective. I hope that answers your question. Thank you. Fidelis.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have two more questions. Okay, first, Dr. Obina, please.
Yes, thank you, Peter, for your presentation. I think I have a concern here. My concern is from the African perspective. Our culture could be seen from our folklores, where you have morals and all that. I want to find out from you, because when we talk about the African culture, and then when we look at them from the folklores, that come from the African continent, they depict peace. They depict harmony. The length and breadth of the continent is riddled with conflict, crisis, all the like. So what's your recipe peace and security in Africa?
Thank you. I didn't hear all the question, and I'm not too sure if it was my end that it dropped out, but I sort of picked it up from the bits and pieces. They often say, It's what you can't hear, or what you can't see, that should assist you with your decision making. When you say African culture,
Okay, I was trying to
entire continent and made up of how many, 54 countries and thousands of, probably 2,000-3,000 languages and thousands of, you know, ancestral heritages and ethnicities. But in terms of how do we manage the conflict? And I think this comes back to building intercultural understanding as a core value and key competency of being a global citizen today. And this is one thing we don't teach at school. We focus on numeracy, literacy, we focus on geography. It's this 18th, 19th century European tradition. I think it comes back to education, because we can engage in you know, dialogue. Dialogue is not about mutual agreement. The premise for dialogue should be based on mutual respect. And this is something we don't see enough of today. And my philosophy has always been, be as hard as you want on the issues, but be extraordinarily kind to each other. Were there other aspects to your question which I didn't answer, or bin Nwadin?
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, yes.
Amaso.
Yes, we have the next question, please.
Okay, my question, I will draw from the lens of Marxism. Marx of the opinion that culture has served to justify inequality. Can you hear me?
It's dropping in and out. Maybe if you can also type your question into the chat, that would also assist.
Can you hear me?
This is what I was going to ask you, please. If you could please put your question into the chat box, because you appear to be interrupting.
Purpose for the elites. Okay.
Okay, could you please put the question in the chat box so we can see it, because we can't hear you well.
Okay. Okay. Sure.
Sorry, Peter, did you see the question?
Yes. Okay. Why is culture the solution when Marx has argued that culture serves to justify inequality? So first of all, I'm not too sure what aspect of culture Karl Marx is referring to here. But I would also put to you is, this is where humanity has arrived at today. There's been conflict since the beginning of time. And I don't think that culture serves to justify inequality and, you know, also conflict. But I also believe that what drives those inequalities and what drives those conflicts is fear. You know, it's you know, it's ignorance. What drives racism and ethnic and race-based discrimination is fear and ignorance. And I think the more education we have, the better. But I also get it. If I look where I live in Australia, the cultural hegemony is an Anglo-Saxon culture. And I experience microaggression and racism on a daily basis. My real name is not Peter. I had to change my name from Panayotis to Peter because my name was weaponized against me. And so many people had to change their name. Now, we've come a long way since then. Okay. And I always think that we have to find ways to be able to look at developing, a shared vision of a future that we want together that allows everyone to have a voice. That's going to be difficult. I live in a multicultural society. I mean, does that mean now that we have to have a government speaking so many different languages and we've become a polyglot society? No, it doesn't mean that. Look, this is a really difficult question. I'm going to be honest. I need to think about it, a lot more. But then you've got some other comments here. Again, the ruling class promotes the culture that promotes the interest. True. Absolutely. I agree with that. But we need to challenge them on a daily basis, because what I have come to realize is that diversity leads to so many benefits. There are a myriad of studies out there. And I talked a little bit about that. I talked about when we bring diverse perspectives together, what do? We innovate. The premise of that innovation needs to be intercultural dialogue. So I think the conversation needs to be about when you take that position of only having one cultural hegemony at the end of the day, and it's going to stamp down on everyone else, you miss out on opportunities. So you need to foster diversity. You need to foster cultural diversity and interaction, because if you don't, you will miss out. There's something called the law of equivariety, one of the principles of thermodynamics, which states that any system, if it's not as equally as varied as the environment it's operating in, will eventually disappear. So I would then say to the ruling class, if you don't become relevant, if you don't understand your environment and you're not in sync with your environment, because people want to see themselves in the other, then you're going to miss out on all the huge opportunities. Many studies. We're working with hospitals here now in Australia, which have recognized that when workforces are mutual in terms of representative of the communities they're delivering services to, they become more efficient. They save so much money on translation costs. And not only that, there are better health outcomes. Which government is not going to want to save money on health? So there's huge benefits. And I think that's where we need education in that. Now, there's another comment here. Why can we not live in a world where culture is silenced and collective humanity is advanced? Well, without culture, what are we? Empty shells. We all have, we're made up of multiple identities. We're all multi-layered. So how can we exist with culture? This is what defines humanity. It's overarching. It's underpinning. I would say to you, what isn't culture? You go out and you do shopping, you experience culture. The moment you interact with someone else, you're interacting through your lens, which is being shaped by your experiences, your lived experiences, and the cultures that have come into contact with you. They've shaped your behaviors, your values, and so many other things. So I'm saying that we now need a new paradigm, a new future, and an age of culture. I know we only have a limited time to talk about this. And I want every single one of you to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'll put my LinkedIn there. I want to continue this discussion with you because I want to learn from you. Thank you.